Hello, this is Mike, and today I'm going to talk about Chapter 10, Content Reading and Writing. And specifically, I'm going to focus on the portion that emphasizes pre-reading and how that could be a useful strategy to help out English learners. So let's get started. Um, Anticipation Guide for the Great Gilly Hopkins. So I recreated a chart that was in our book, and it basically is a good way to have students use anticipation as a way to interact with the text that they're going to be reading. So here it says before reading the book, they have to answer these questions to sort of probe their thinking. So they have to mention whether they agree, disagree, or agree somewhat, or strongly disagree. And this is where they're going to answer the questions here before reading. They just write their answers, and it just has questions here like prejudice comes from being ignorant, whether they agree with that or not. People can overcome ignorance and prejudice, so you can have your students do a quick pair share. So it's a good way to get English learners to interact with one another and discuss ideas. It sort of gets them thinking about the content that they're going to be delving into when they're reading. And it's also a good way to, of course, have them practice their academic language, um, interact with accelerated learners so they can really rehearse the way they're going to speak, and if you're having them share out. So it's a good way to just have students think about their answers before sharing, as opposed to just being called randomly or having them raise their hands, which generally they're not going to do. So I decided to take this template and adjust it to fit my social science or history subject. So on this slide here, I decided to create my own, and the content would be focused on the American Revolution. So before reading the primary source document, it's a, this is assuming that students are going to be reading primary sources about loyalists and the reasons to remain in the British colonies, and patriots who were against the British Crown, and founding fathers and their key reasons for declaring independence. So basically, this is going to get students to grapple with and sort of think about some of the content that we're going to get into in the class, and answer these questions, or just really discuss whether they believe that the Patriots were justified in tarring and feathering tax collectors, for instance. And a lot of people might say, yeah, of course, they totally were. It was unjust that they were taxing without representation. If they have that background knowledge, they'll be able to answer these, no problem. The colonists were in favor of revolting against the British Crown, and most likely they'll say yes, of course, because there was a revolution. So most of them, or all of them, felt the same way. And the Constitution guaranteed rights for every American. Again, it might gear them towards an answer that says, of course. But after reading the primary sources, they'll soon discover that there's a lot of nuance when it comes to history, and it gets them to look at different points of view and understand that there were a lot of, like I mentioned, loyalists, people that wanted to remain in the British colonies, and they sort of saw patriots as dangerous and um, almost, I guess you could say, treasonous, because they saw their loyalty as lying to or pertaining to the British. And so that would probably change after reading their opinion. They might say, "Oh, well, I disagree with that view now because I was presented with this evidence." And the Constitution guaranteeing the rights of every American. Upon reading and sort of discussing with their peers, students will be able to determine that that probably wasn't the case. It was just guaranteed to rich males who own land. Um, so I really like these templates that sort of encourage students to think prior to reading, and it gives them a purpose um, in talking about the content before engaging in it, and then they're going to stick with the same topics after they read it. So it sort of reinforces this idea of what are we reading and what is the reason we're reading it and what am I supposed to get out of it, rather than giving a student a graphic organizer to just begin reading without any sort of reason to do it. Students will gladly read it and just not think about it further. Just say, okay, I'm done reading. But what did you get out of it? What did this mean? So I think it's a great way to, uh, in a way, model what you're expecting to your students, but also it serves as a visual scaffold. So it allows students to be able to focus their understanding on a certain point, which would be just I agree or I disagree, and then they'll be able to engage in class discussions that way. So that was my take on chapter 10.